The wine glass was still half finished on the living room table, and his jacket, draped over the armchair, seemed to be waiting for a body that never returned. When the clock passed midnight, I already knew that something terrible had happened. Elijah had left for a work meeting in Midtown. He promised he'd be home early. But by that hour, there were no texts, no calls, no sign of him. His cell phone went straight to voicemail, and my heart, tightening with every beat, seemed to know the truth long before my mind allowed itself to understand. I stared out the window 20 times that early morning, convinced he would appear any moment, tired, with a smile and an excuse. But dawn broke, and with the light came an absolute silence, as if the world had simply swallowed the man I loved. I walked into the Atlanta Police Department precinct with a dry throat and shaking hands. I tried to sound firm as I explained that my husband hadn't come home, that this was completely out of character. The clerk handed me a form in a neutral voice, treating it like just another case. And in that instant, I understood that pain could also be bureaucratic. I described his clothes, his height, his last known location. Every detail I filled in seemed to bury the idea that he would ever come back. Smiling as if nothing had happened, they asked if we had argued, if there was any reason he might want to disappear. No. No. 1,000 times number. I left the precinct holding a copy of the police report, a hollow ache in my chest that no one there seemed capable of grasping. We covered Atlanta with his face. We taped posters near the 5 Points Transit Hub, at the entrance to Hartsfield-Jackson's domestic terminal, on every corner of our neighborhood, even at the local coffee shop where he got his morning brew. My friends took turns calling hospitals, shelters, and emergency services, as if sheer persistence could somehow defeat fate. Every time my cell phone rang, my heart jumped, but it was always a wrong number, a cruel prank, a voice promising clues for dollars, or someone just playing with my grief. The entire city felt like a cruel theater where he had vanished from the stage without a trace, and yet, every corner, every familiar noise made me snap my head around, as if by some miracle he might be standing there. Days passed. The Fulton County search team's efforts yielded nothing but empty leads. They reviewed traffic cameras, questioned witnesses, cross-referenced databases. Nothing, not a physical trace, not a bank transaction, not an image confirming his whereabouts. After 10:47 p.m. the police asked for patience, but the word missing felt like a floating sentence with no expiration date. The uncertainty was a bottomless pit where every minute was poison, and the cruelest part was that the world kept functioning as if his absence didn't matter at all. I had to open his laptop, organize his bills, review our joint accounts, as if he were already gone. I found unread emails, payment reminders, pending meetings, as if his life had been paused, waiting for someone to pick up the thread. Every click was a stab. His name on a statement, his number on a subscription, his login details on my phone. I tried to be efficient, but every data point was a new ghost. At home, his toothbrush remained in its holder, untouched, an emotional trap. One afternoon, an anonymous call came in. A rideshare driver swore he had driven Elijah toward an exit off I-85. The man was nervous, quiet, with a minor cut on his forehead. I rushed to that area as if the air could carry me faster than the traffic, but there was nothing concrete there. The driver barely recalled any other details, a pale face, a lost look, silence. The police took note, thanked him for the help, and that was it. It was an ambiguous lead that tormented me for weeks without offering any real answers. Months passed like a long chain of gray days. The lawyer explained that we could legally start the process to declare an administrative absence. It was hard to accept that words like absence, presumption, and incapacity were now part of my vocabulary. He spoke of procedures, deadlines, and official publications. While I continued to look for anything that would disprove it all, I felt like signing those papers would be sealing his death while he was still alive. But without a response, even the law grew tired of waiting. We decided to hold a memorial service at the community church. No body, no certainty, but with a silence that felt too full. Friends came, some family, even coworkers who were already talking about him in the past tense. I prepared a symbolic box with photos and his favorite watch, hoping that fake enclosure would give me the right to keep breathing. When the pastor said his name, my throat constricted like a stone, yet, walking out of there made me feel more alone than ever. Time didn't heal anything. I became an automaton who went to work, paid bills, answered calls, and returned home to stare at an empty sofa. People assumed I was dead inside, but I kept getting "I'm sorry" messages, as if someone knew more than I did. Some told me I should get on with my life. Others called me a saint for holding on. I didn't know what I was, a widow without a body, a wife without a husband, or a woman suspended in a second that would never end. My nights were long, and my mornings were hollow. I started receiving a provisional life insurance payout, and every dollar that came in was a reminder that the system already considered him dead. I closed his accounts, cancelled contracts, sold the car that would never be parked in our driveway again. Little by little, my house truly became mine, without his smell, without his papers, without his shoes thrown in the hallway. I became the heir to an absence, and far from consoling me, that weighed on me like a debt I never asked for. It was on an ordinary Tuesday, on the MARTA train line at around 8:15 a.m., between Peachtree Center and Vine City. "Excuse me, can I just get by?" A voice murmured behind me, and my world shattered in a second. I instinctively turned and saw an unmistakable profile, a jawline I had kissed 1,000 times. It was him. Not a shadow, not a subconscious mistake. It was my husband, a year later, asking to pass on the train like any other stranger. My body reacted before my mind did. My vision blurred, my heart pounded like a war drum, and my hands started shaking. I didn't know what to say, what to do, or even if I should scream his name. I felt everything I had learned to control overflow. I stood motionless, watching him move a few steps away, oblivious to the storm he had just caused. It was him, but he didn't look at me as if I no longer existed. I didn't say a word. I didn't run. I didn't confront him. I got off at the next station and moved to the next car, following him from a distance like a shadow whose eyes were full of questions. He got off at a small station indicator with the routine calm of someone who does it every day. He walked unhurriedly. He knew the neighborhood. He even waved to a baker as if he were a regular customer. My legs felt weak, but I followed him down a narrow street where he entered a doorway without looking back. And there I stood, trembling in front of a door that sealed a year of pain. From the sidewalk, I watched him enter the building, pulling a key from his pocket as if he'd been doing it for years. He pressed the buzzer without hesitation, and a woman came down to open the door. It wasn't his mother, his sister, or anyone from our circle. They hugged and spoke in low voices. He smiled. The elevator swallowed them, and the door closed like a sentence. I stood paralyzed, as if I had just watched a dead man living a different life that didn't include me. I went home shaking, my breath ragged. And the next day, I hired a private investigator. I needed proof. I needed the truth. I gave him the address and the description, showed him old photos to confirm if it was the same person. In the detective's eyes, there was no doubt, but I couldn't rely on just what I'd seen. I wanted documented certainty, not intuition broken by fear. The detective took the case professionally, without asking questions, as if he'd seen this situation countless times before. A few days later, he handed me a dossier, photographs taken from the street, videos recorded with a zoom lens from a nearby park. My husband left that building every morning, walked to a coffee shop, took the MARTA, and returned in the evening, always with the same woman, in intimate, real, everyday moments. These were the gestures of a couple, not of temporary help. There was no doubt. He was alive. He was there, and he was living as if he had never known me. One morning, I gathered my courage and went back to the building. I waited until someone went in and slipped in behind them. I rang every buzzer until a neighbor opened the door, and I confronted her directly. I asked about him, his name, his history. The woman looked at me with a mixture of discomfort and pity. "No one with that name lives here," she told me. I tried to press the issue, but she quickly closed the door in my face. The silence was now crueler than the lie. The detective returned a few days later with a new piece of the puzzle. Medical reports obtained through contacts at a nearby hospital. Apparently, my husband had been admitted months earlier after a fall in public, with a severe traumatic brain injury. He was treated for weeks at Emory University Hospital and then referred for outpatient follow-up. The diagnosis included retrograde amnesia and temporal disorientation. He couldn't remember who he was, where he came from, or who he had left behind. According to the report, a woman who was passing by on the street was the one who called the ambulance and then stayed with him during his admission. She offered him shelter, clothes, and help with formalities while he recovered, never knowing his true name. He wasn't listed on any official form beyond the nickname they gave him in the ER. Slowly, with her support, he began to reintegrate, learn new routines, and build a life with no prior references. It was a story of aid, not conspiracy. For weeks, the detective observed his new routine. Elijah worked as an assistant in an auto shop, ate at local diners, and came home at the same time. He was a functional man, kind and reserved. He didn't appear to be faking, didn't avoid anyone, showed no signs of distress. He was living with that woman as if she were his only history, without looking back. What was a deep loss for me was a new existence without memory for him. I called the hospital from a blocked number and asked to speak to the clinical archive. I gave them the name he was now using and the approximate date of his admission. It took a few days, but they finally confirmed it. He had been admitted with trauma, was transferred to neurology, and was later medically discharged. Weeks later, I requested access to his history, even though I knew it would be difficult without authorization. Still, the data matched. My husband had been there. It wasn't an invention. It was a documented fact, the neurologist who treated him noted in the report: persistent retrograde amnesia with profound gaps and difficulty recovering personal identity. Apparently, he could remember general concepts, but not faces, names, or specific bonds. He could learn new tasks and retain recent information, but the past before the accident was completely erased. There were no signs of feigning or any indication of intent. He didn't know who he was, and to him, I was just another stranger among millions. The narrative fit. Someone collapses on the street, wakes up in a hospital without ID, and a woman becomes his only reference. He didn't lie about his identity because he didn't have one. She gave him a name and a provisional home that over time became permanent. He accepted what was around him because he had nothing to compare it to. He didn't betray anything, he simply lived what was offered to him, and I, meanwhile, was mourning an absence he never felt, while I organized the grief, managed certificates, and signed declarations of absence. He never claimed his identity because he didn't remember having one. No office received a report from him. No public record detected contradictions. It was as if he had been born that day. His silence was a consequence, not a choice. And I had done everything by the book, but with a truth that was now shattering. Everything I had built in his absence could be challenged by him. I refused to believe that someone could forget the person they loved. Forget a home, a marriage, an entire life. Something inside me screamed that it was impossible, that a memory had to remain somewhere in his body, or he was faking it. And what if that woman convinced him to leave everything behind? The rage blinded me because the uncertainty was crueler than death. Not knowing if he was a victim or an accomplice tore me apart inside. I went back to our old house and collected photos, videos, letters, and texts, everything that proved our life together had existed. I spoke with friends, neighbors, and old coworkers who could attest that our bond was real and deep. I gathered certificates, dates, signed contracts, and available witnesses. I wanted to build a timeline that left no room for doubt. If he didn't remember, I would remember for both of us. I requested a meeting, went to Naomi's house, and spoke to her plainly. That man is my husband. He disappeared over a year ago, and I've been looking for him ever since." She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and compassion, not aggression. She said she didn't know anything, that she took him in because he was disoriented and hurt, and that she never investigated beyond what he told her. She offered me a cup of coffee, but I couldn't even swallow my own saliva. Still, I didn't hate her. She seemed sincere. For days, I didn't sleep, trapped by an unanswerable question. Was she a life thief or a good person in the wrong place? There were no signs of manipulation, but she also didn't immediately seek professional help when he couldn't recall his name. Was it protection or convenience? I would have moved heaven and earth, but she just cared for him and ended up living with him as if no other story had ever existed. A mediator specialized in trauma proposed a joint meeting: me, her, a neurologist, and a clinical psychologist. The goal was to avoid further harm and explore avenues for truth without confrontation. Naomi accepted immediately. I hesitated, but I knew an open war would destroy everyone. Elijah attended with a confused look, unsure why two women were talking about him as if he were an invisible trial. During the session, we showed him old photos, our vacation in New Orleans, our wedding in Charleston, SC, the day we got our dog. He looked at them attentively, recognizing nothing, until his eyes welled up at a picture of us in Piedmont Park. He said he felt something, a pressure in his chest, a kind of emotional vertigo, but he couldn't name it. His body seemed to remember what his mind had erased. The hospital confirmed in writing his admission on March 18, a TBI with loss of consciousness, and his medical release on April 10. The reports detailed the exams, neurological consultations, and outpatient follow-up. Everything matched the time frame of his disappearance. The chronology explained everything. There was solid medical evidence supporting his amnesia, even though my heart resisted believing it. Then another doubt arose. What about the money during his amnesia? Were funds moved from our accounts? Did someone manage his assets without authorization? I checked old statements and saw strange transfers, automatic payments that no one cancelled, and charges that didn't make sense. Was it her? Was it him on autopilot? I didn't know if I was facing negligence or something more serious. I asked for an explanation, and Naomi quickly showed me papers, bills, receipts, everything in her name. She had paid for rent, food, medicine, and even his medical consultations out of her own pocket. "I never used money that wasn't mine," she said, looking me in the eye. And for the first time, I felt something close to respect. She may not have been perfect, but she didn't seem like an opportunist. I heard a recording where he called her affectionately. He used pet names, telling her about his day with a closeness that hurt. It wasn't a distant or forced relationship. It was sincere affection built in everyday life. In that house, he recognized her as his partner, and even though he didn't remember his former life, he seemed to have found equilibrium in the new one. It broke my heart to see that to him, I only existed as a stranger's story. The family was divided. Some blamed me for not finding him sooner, as if I hadn't done everything humanly possible. Others defended the woman who helped him, thankful that someone saved him when no one else could. At family gatherings, no one spoke of him without tension. I was the official wife, but not the one who had been with him when he was hurting. I felt judged even by those who knew nothing. A digital media journalist picked up the story, the missing husband who reappeared without memory and with another life. In a few days, it was a dinner table topic on radio shows, even in memes. No one asked me if I wanted to be exposed, if I could bear reading strangers' opinions about my life. Some called me a martyr, others called me exaggerated, and still others defended him as the victim of a cold system. I lost control of my own story. My lawyer recommended starting protective measures, to secure the assets, review actions signed during his amnesia, and establish his civil status. We didn't want a lawsuit, but we couldn't leave everything to chance. We requested access to his documentation, an official medical evaluation, and limits on financial decisions. The law had to intervene, though no one was quite sure how to classify his case. Love, unfortunately, carried no legal weight. We requested the court to preserve shared assets, block joint accounts, and review movements made in his name. I wasn't seeking punishment, I was seeking clarity. While he couldn't fully recover his identity, it was risky to allow him to freely dispose of what we had built together. It was hard to see all this in cold papers, stamps, and signatures, but doing nothing and losing everything twice would have been worse. We initiated a formal verification process, fingerprint comparison, DNA testing, biometric data comparison. Even though I knew it was him, the state needed proof. His new ID had a different name, a different address, a registration date that was after his disappearance. Legally, there were two different men, and only one had the right to return to being my husband, if he so desired. The experts quickly confirmed it was the same person. Coinciding fingerprints, identical DNA, unquestionable biometric features. But they insisted that his diagnosis remained valid, persistent retrograde amnesia with no complete spontaneous recovery. There was no pretense or trickery. It was him, but he didn't know it. A biological certainty without an emotional connection. In a controlled room with cameras and therapists present, I sat across from him. I spoke calmly. I mentioned dates, anecdotes, the names of people we loved. His face twitched. Sometimes he smiled reflexively, other times he seemed confused or even ashamed. I showed him our wedding photo, and he said it was a beautiful image, but he didn't recognize himself. I left there shattered, as if I had lost someone who is still alive. He looked at me with kindness, even affection, but it was the same look he gave his physical therapist or a waiter. Sometimes, in brief lapses, he called me by Naomi's name. Then he would apologize without knowing why. It was clear he wasn't faking, but it was also clear that I wasn't in his present. Seeing him so close and yet so far was like living in a state of mourning without a body or a date. Naomi, the woman who had taken him in, proposed an agreement to collaborate, not to hide anything, and to let the doctors do their work without pressure. She offered to share the calendar of his therapies, his progress, and even to allow for contact between him and me in neutral settings. There was no resentment in her tone, just fatigue and humanity. It was a gesture I hadn't expected, and despite myself, I was grateful for it. He began an intensive cognitive rehabilitation program with memory exercises, sensory stimulation, and emotional therapy. He regained practical skills and even remembered songs or automatic gestures, but intimate memories remained scattered. Sometimes he woke up with the feeling of having dreamed about me, but he couldn't tell me what it was. I attended some sessions, watching him reconstruct what we had already lived. His effort was real, but his voids were deeper than we imagined. We reviewed all the legal actions signed during his amnesic state. Contracts, authorizations, bank movements. Some bore his signature, but the content was incomprehensible to someone who didn't remember who he was. Was he aware? Was he mentally competent? The lawyer warned about the possible nullity of those documents. I wondered if he had been manipulated or simply guided by the inertia of survival. A legal table was organized with representatives from both sides to negotiate a provisional solution. We agreed to temporarily freeze certain funds, review the transfers, and halt asset decisions until everything was clear. We weren't looking for culprits, we were looking for justice. The tone was tense but civilized. It was painful to talk about money while my marriage hung by an invisible thread. In one of the sessions, while looking at one of our albums, he said, "My name, Aisha," in a broken voice, as if emerging from a dark tunnel. Afterward, he denied it. He didn't remember saying it, but the therapist wrote it down. He also said he dreamed of a woman who smelled like jasmine, which was the perfume I wore when we met. His emotions were there, floating without roots, and I just wanted to believe that something inside him was still mine. In nights of rage, I found myself imagining how sweet revenge would be, denouncing everyone, emptying the accounts, disappearing. I also wanted him to feel the abandonment, the fear, the desperation that he had left as my inheritance, but I forced myself to think about the collateral damage, the person who was legally not his father, the mutual friends, the broken family. Emotional justice couldn't justify destroying the innocent, and I still wanted to heal, not to destroy. One night, his mother called me after months of silence. She asked me not to pressure him, to give him time, to have compassion. She was broken, too, torn between the son she raised and the man who now didn't recognize her. She pleaded for unity, not conflict. She wanted to form a common front to protect him, though no one knew exactly from what. We cried together over the phone without reproaches, only with the raw truth between the words. Naomi made the difficult decision to step away for a while. She moved out, stayed at a friend's house, and facilitated all the requested documents. She wanted him to have space free from emotional influence so he could decide autonomously. She even gave me a journal he had kept during his amnesia, full of doubts, scattered phrases, fears, and dreams. Her gesture changed the climate of everything. It was the first time I felt we weren't enemies. We met at the county court to formalize a civil agreement, asset protection, suspension of legal decisions by Elijah until further medical review, and continuity in his treatment. It was the first time we saw each other face to face without therapists or third parties, just with our lawyers. He looked at me as if searching for something in my eyes that would make sense of it all, and though there were no big words, there was a clean silence that was already a beginning. The judge ruled that there was no crime, no fraud, no impersonation, and no bad faith, only a chain of medical and human circumstances. The resolution established civil, not criminal, measures and allowed room for a possible future restitution if he requested it. It was a bitter victory. I hadn't lost, but I hadn't won either. I left the courthouse with a new feeling. Justice doesn't cure everything. With time, he began to remember fragments. A song we danced to, an argument in a market, an afternoon trip to Savannah, Georgia. They weren't exact reconstructions, but sensations that troubled him without knowing why. Sometimes he would look at me and say, "You remind me of something good, but I don't know what." That phrase became my daily comfort. It wasn't love yet, but it wasn't absolute forgetting either. When the doctors declared that his memory would never fully return, we asked him what he wanted to do. He lowered his head, took a breath, and said he couldn't choose between two lives that didn't feel like his own. With me, he had memories he didn't remember. With Naomi, he had bonds he hadn't chosen. He didn't know if he wanted to try with me or start from what his heart dictated. Now, freedom had become an abyss without a compass. I then made my own decision. I would not live in the eternal wait for a gesture, a sign, or an ambiguous promise. I requested financial autonomy, separated my assets, and began to rebuild a life without depending on his emotional return, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. If he chose me, it would have to be from the present, not from nostalgia. It hurt, yes, but it also set me free. Naomi signed a document renouncing any patrimonial claim, acknowledging that she did everything out of humanity, not self-interest. She made it clear that she loved him, but his well-being was more important than her desire. It was her way of closing the circle without drama or revenge. That act calmed the waters and disarmed all suspicion. Sometimes, love also knows when to leave gracefully. Elijah and I agreed to start a form of couples therapy adapted to his situation. No expectations, no pressure, just exploring whether something could be reborn. We saw each other once a week in a neutral room. We shared memories, scents, objects, and songs. We weren't trying to recover the past, but to invent a new language. Every step was minimal, but sincere. We learned to recognize each other from scratch, without labels. We began to share simple gestures, having coffee in silence, walking through Piedmont Park, watching a show without needing to talk. There were moments when he looked at me with a serene familiarity, as if he didn't know who I was but liked being close. We didn't force anything. It was a mutual learning process, full of pauses, full of attempts, And for the first time in a long time, it didn't hurt. He never recovered everything. Our wedding photos looked like scenes from a stranger's life. Our private jokes no longer made him laugh. There were gaps that no exercise could fill. But sometimes he would wake up and whisper words only we used, fragments, reflections, sparks. Full memory never returned. But life isn't just about remembering. It's also about choosing. And he was starting to choose me. I learned to forgive without denying the pain. I didn't excuse everything, but I understood that no one chose what happened. I forgave the accident, the absence, even the new life he started without me. Forgiving wasn't forgetting, it was deciding to live without the poison of resentment. I didn't want to be a martyr, a victim, or a heroine, just a woman who knew when to stop the suffering when it was leading nowhere. We stayed together, but not as before. We were two people accompanying each other with care, respect, and new boundaries. We slept in separate rooms. Sometimes we went out holding hands. Sometimes we didn't. Trust was built slowly, without shortcuts. Love was an open question every morning. And we accepted that even if we weren't the same people, we could still be something. Betrayal is not always intentional. Sometimes life decides for us and forces us to start over with broken pieces. I chose to stay while there was authentic love, even if it wasn't the same as before, but I also knew that if one day only routine remained, I would leave without a sound, with dignity. The truth was my only commitment. And that was the freedom that finally gave me back my peace. There were no fireworks, no perfect reconciliations, and no full memory. But there was humanity, courage, and a new way of being. This wasn't the story I imagined. It was the one I had to learn to live, and between the wound and the reunion, I chose to move forward with scars, yes, but also with the certainty that when love is real, it always finds a way to stay. Sometimes I find myself looking at old photos and thinking that I'll never see the man he was then. But I also understand that that ghost no longer exists. The person in front of me is different, broken in some places, rebuilt in others, and yet, he is still someone I want. Grief transformed into acceptance, not resignation, but a conscious choice to keep walking without the need to look back. I've learned that love is not just shared memory, but also the will to be in the present, even if the recollections don't match. In his eyes, I no longer find my past, but a new calm, a serene affection that needs no explanation. That serenity sustains me more than the nostalgia for what we had. Perhaps fate stole our story, but it gave us the opportunity to write another one. Imperfect and fragile, but real, my nights are still long, but no longer empty. I fill them with books, walks, conversations with myself and with him when he's willing. I have stopped looking for signs of what was and concentrate on what is. I don't live waiting for miracles of memory. I live appreciating the small gestures that remind me we're still here. That is now my way of resisting, inhabiting the present with dignity. Sometimes they ask me if I would choose him again, knowing everything that happened. And the answer isn't simple. I don't know if I would choose him as a husband, but I would choose him as a partner in learning, because no one else has shown me so brutally what it means to lose and start over. Our union is no longer a marriage in the traditional sense, but it is still an inexplicable bond. And that, even if it hurts, is also love. The future is uncertain. Perhaps one day we'll separate. Perhaps we'll stay together until the end. But that doubt no longer torments me. The important thing is that I no longer feel imprisoned by the past or victimized by an unanswered disappearance. I regained the voice I had lost amidst paperwork, tears, and silence, and with that voice, I learned to narrate my life again. Even with scars, life didn't return to what it was. But it didn't stop either. With every dawn, I understood that it wasn't necessary to have all the pieces to move forward. Love, loss, memory, and forgiveness intertwine.